We now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our first panel of guests. Matt Parr, and Matt, you used to be the former inspector at HMICFRS, and you've been a great support to this committee over the years. Thank you very much. Kirsty Brimelow, KC, a barrister for Doughty Street Chambers, thank you so much for coming. And hopefully during the course of this, Lord Walney is on his way in. So let's just pause for a second. No. Well, I think we'll continue, and he'll make his way through our various gates. Lord Walney is the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption, so he'll hopefully be with us very shortly. So I'm going to go to our first question, and it will be to all of you, please. I'll start with you, Matt. The Met has described the period since 7th of October 2023 as the greatest period of sustained pressure on the Metropolitan Police since the Olympics in 2012. Do you agree with this statement?
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's good to be back. They say that about everything. I've heard this is the toughest we've ever had it. I think every year that I was inspecting the Met, there was something. So I'm not belittling the impact it's had, and it certainly will have had an enormous impact on staff numbers. But whether or not it's the greatest, I don't think that's subject to empirical analysis. And some of the claims I've heard along that line from the Met over the years have, on subsequent analysis, turned out to be exaggerations. The answer is I don't know, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's certainly been a significant effect for them. Whether it's the greatest in memory, who knows?
Well, thank you for your honesty there. Kirsty, can I ask you what your view is?
Again, as a lawyer, as a lawyer, I really deal with those cases going through the courts. I'm probably not the best in terms of any quantitative analysis on that. It's a statement that's familiar, and it's been familiar throughout my career as a barrister whenever there have been intense periods of protests. So that's over the last, I probably practiced in protest law, represented protesters over the last couple of decades, and every time, whether it's, everybody might recall the May Day riots, yes. Which and that was a time when there would have been similar pronouncements of alarm. That there's ebbs and flows, and the topics and what exercises people change as society evolves as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you both, in your opinion, how well has the Met dealt with the level of regular, large-scale protests since the 7th of October? And what has it done well, and what could it do better? Do you want to start, Kirsty?
My view is that pre-COVID, the Met appeared to be much more clear as to how to enforce the law in relation to crimes that might have been committed, and balancing proportionality, so balancing the rights of the protesters, so applying proportionality, which means that the police must facilitate a protester's right to protest. So as well as enforcing it, there is a positive duty on police to actually assist protesters and facilitate it in a way, obviously, that is lawful. And there was a series of steps that the police would use before they moved to arrest, and they included effectively persuasion to the protester. With the last question being something along the lines of, is there anything I can say or do to persuade you to move now? If, say, it was somebody who was gluing themselves to a door, to move away voluntarily, with the last resort being enforcement. That was pre-COVID, and I can think of one case in particular, which was at the Park Lane Hotel pre-COVID, where Extinction Rebellion had glued themselves to the glass of a door in protest or to get their message across to the CEOs of the major fossil fuel producers who were having a conference inside. And we could see then on the body cam these steps being carried out well and efficiently, not without error, but there was some structure to it. However, post-COVID, I don't see that as much. I know of, and also post the legislation that came in, which was the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in 2022, and then the Public Order Act in 2023. Now, they introduced new offences, and also the Public Order Act lowered the threshold for disruption from serious to more than minor. Now, those regulations which lowered that threshold currently are in a status where they've been declared unlawful by the High Court, but it's in a state of limbo. And I know of cases earlier, shortly after the Public Order Act, where one protest of Just Stop Oil protesters was slow walking over Lambeth Bridge. And within 10 minutes, there was an additional condition added to the protest using the new law under the Public Order Act, is Section 12 condition, and that's one of the ones that's been declared unlawful. And then there was, within 15 minutes, arrests made. And the inconvenience, the disruption caused, according to what I've seen, probably was in the range of about 5 minutes inconvenience to traffic. There was a lane for emergency vehicles to pass, and this was not an extensive blockade. So already there are concerns about proportionality, whether enforcement should have happened so quickly in those cases. And those cases are going through the magistrates' courts currently. And as far as I understand it, many of them currently have resulted in not guilty verdicts. So just to summarise that, I am concerned that there's a move towards quick enforcement, which there shouldn't be. Enforcement should be a last resort when people are exercising the rights to protest. And I really go back to not only the common law right and the importance of the common law right in our country, in our jurisdiction, but also the rights that arose and came under the European Convention of Human Rights, which came out of, obviously, the atrocities in World War II. And protest is a cornerstone of democracy. So I am concerned about enforcement perhaps being too quick currently.
OK, thank you. Matt, the same question. How do you think the Met have dealt with this?
Well, those of you who've heard me here before, formally or informally, will know that I'm not slow to criticise the Met when I think they're getting things wrong. Like all organisations, big organisations, they're never consistently good or consistently bad at what they do. And whereas the Met's got a lot of shortcomings, I would say public order is one of the things it actually does very well. I've spent a lot of time with their public order commanders, and indeed officers on the front line, and I've done similar in other parts of the country. And I would say the level of expertise and experience in policing in the Met is on a different level to most, if not all, other forces around the country, largely because they get so much practice and the demands on them are significantly greater than they are elsewhere. So, with a sort of military background and with quite a lot of experience in running high-risk operations, I would say that the Met's command and control of public order problems in the capital, by and large, and particularly around the government control zone in central London, is very good. And they've got some very experienced people. Unlike other parts of the country, they've got people for whom being good at public order is almost a full-time job. So there's a lot of experience and a lot of expertise and a lot of good advice available to the people that are running operations in central London. It is worth noticing that as far as I'm aware, no doubt we'll talk about some of the other controversies that the demonstrations in central London over the last 12 months have caused, but there doesn't, if there has been any serious injury or serious criminal damage to anything, I am not aware of it. And so the Met have taken head on the most serious risk of that and actually dealt with it very well, is my view. However, I think some of the way that it has been portrayed, and it is incredibly difficult. The thing about protest policing is that you're never going to get praised for your response. If people agree with the aim of the protest, they will resent and find themselves in opposition to the way it's policed. If they're anti, if it's policed rigorously, they're going to be objecting. If they don't agree with the aim of the protest, they're going to inevitably think that the policing of it was too lenient. So you get this kind of, unlike a murder. I know this is a false comparison, but unlike a murder, where if the perpetrator is identified and prosecuted, everybody's going to approve of what the police have done. They're never going to get universal approval for almost anything which is public order or protest related. Having taken that into account, I think that the Met are open to criticism for being slow to explain some of their actions and not proactive in educating the public about the challenges they face and why they behave the way they do. But if you ask the basic question of have they done a decent job with the protesting over the last year, my answer is yes, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's good to have slightly differing views because we only learn when we hear different people's views, in my opinion. Lord Walney, thank you so much.
I think first, Kirsty and I are not going to agree about where the balance of competing rights sits. We both, I think, will agree that there is a balance to be struck. I think where that balance should lie is probably the point of difference between your members of the panel.
Yeah, and I suspect most of the public. Lord Walney, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to ask you the questions I've asked our other two guests. If you could just give us a brief comment on them and then we'll proceed. So the Met has described the period since 7th of October 2023 as, and I'm quoting, the greatest period of sustained pressure on the Met since the Olympics in 2012. Do you agree with this statement? And in your opinion, how well has the Met dealt with the level of regular large-scale protests since the 7th of October?
Well, Madam Chair Committee, first of all, many apologies for being late. It's entirely an error on my part. I thought you were starting at 10:30 and there was no reason for me to think that because you had been quite clear you were starting at 10. So
don't worry.
I'll try and talk fast to make up for it. On the first question, yes, I think it is quite clear that the level of strain that's on the Metropolitan Police as a result of primarily as a result of the weekly drumbeat of protests, as was on the Gaza issue, has placed a huge strain on the force, and that has ratcheted up into many tens of millions of pounds and thousands of rest days, which ultimately have to be paid back. And I have sympathy for the leadership of the Metropolitan Police, who are juggling all of the policing priorities that are set for them by political leaders and the public. And are operating within a framework at present where there can be the strain on their resources cannot in any way be taken into account in managing the level of demand for protests. So if an organisation or organisations wish to stage a weekly or even daily, but however frequent a large-scale protest, they are obliged to agree to that and to police it. And my concern has been, in looking at this in my role as the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption, is that, you know, ultimately that will either have to be met by significantly increased resources from central government at a time when resources are clearly sparse, or frontline policing priorities will suffer. And so it has been one of the recommendations in my recent review to the government, which was published, as it turned out, 24 hours before the election was called and is now being considered by the new government, is either for some method of contribution towards the cost of policing process for particular organisations who choose to have large-scale repeat demonstrations, or for the police to be able to factor in the cost of resourcing and the cost to other frontline policing areas when making decisions on whether a particular march can go ahead in a particular way at a particular time. They have no authority to do that at the moment, and that for me is a gap. On the second issue of how well they've done, I think, like Matt Parr, and forgive me for having missed your contribution, Kirsty, I have a real level of sympathy for the difficulty of the task that the Met has to do given the circumstances. I think that the charge of two-tier policing, as it is commonly understood, is not correct. I don't believe that anyone in the Met or leadership goes in consciously, or I think largely either consciously or subconsciously, largely, and wishes to treat different protests in different ways. Nevertheless, I have been really concerned with the level of criminality that has been on display in protests and the evident difficulty that police officers have in being able to charge all of that criminality, even when it is readily in evidence at times on social media. Now, some of that, I think, is inevitable. The police cannot be everywhere, and I think the police leadership have pointed out examples where provocative imagery may have been shown in amidst a crowd momentarily, and a photo taken for social media and then vanished. Nevertheless, there are also incidents where, and I think you can look at this last weekend, where there were banners on display in clear support of a proscribed terrorist organisation, Hezbollah, committed to the violent eradication of Israel, which is in clear contravention to the law, which were not picked up at the time. And that goes into a question of policing tactics, where the police rightly point out that they have a responsibility to maintain public order, and that in some circumstances you will have that action which they might otherwise want to take may result in a hostile situation being exacerbated. I can understand the line of that argument, but it does create an issue where some of these clear offences are not being immediately brought to justice in the way that we would all like to see.
Okay, thank you. We're actually going to go into some of these issues slightly more in some of the additional questions. But now I'll hand over to Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. Lord Walney, just touching on this business of asking protest organisers to make a financial contribution to the cost of policing protests, how would government avoid stifling freedom of expression and right of lawful assembly as set out in the Human Rights Act? 1998, if organisers had to stump up some cash to pay for the protests themselves?
It's a really important question, and I think my proposal has sometimes been mischaracterised by a kind of pay to protest automatically, and that's absolutely not how anything could work. And in my mind, and look, this is not a straightforward proposal, I'll grant you, but in my mind, it could be appropriate to ask large organisations to make a contribution in circumstances where they are choosing the method of repeat mass demonstrations over a period of time, like you have seen in the others. So the question of a single organisation wanting to protest, I think there would be no question. I don't think there would be any support really for doing that. But ultimately, I think it's important for people to bear in mind that in this liberal democracy in which we are blessed to live in this country, there are many ways in which it is possible to get your point of view across, many channels to do that. And mass demonstrations turning up in a particular place at a particular time is only one way of doing that. And if an organisation chooses that particular method, week after week after week, and you can see the strain which it is putting on other policing areas. Of course, in an ideal world, all of these costs would be met somewhere else, but we are demonstrably not in a world where there is ideal resources, and you are having to weigh up cuts to other frontline areas to carry on policing.
If I may, just one further check. Are we not running the risk, though, of it being those with the deepest pockets, those who can be externally funded, possibly by dark money, can simply apply time and time and time and time again and say, I'm doing this within the letter of the regulations. I can afford to pay, therefore I'd like to do this every week. And there's no audit trail. There's no real question about where, real knowledge of where the money's coming from, unless you're going to create a whole new mechanism for auditing the organisations to find out precisely who's funding those campaigns. It's privatisation of the protest, surely.
I don't accept that, but I think in any circumstances where you're asking for a contribution, then issues of affordability can apply. I think that's why it's really important that if you brought in such a proposal, you would set it at a level that was not in any way stifling organisations with smaller levels of resources or who wanted to make occasional protests. But I suppose I would put the question back to lawmakers of what is the alternative in this current situation. Now, I think one other alternative is another of my recommendations is that you allow the police to factor in when their resources are. If you don't want to have any kind of charging mechanism, and I understand where there could be reticence to do that, but if not, then it seems to me you are left with a choice of either an ever greater funding from the public purse for these protests. People can make that argument, but at a time when money is tight, I think you have to be clear that that will mean a particular pot of money coming from central government in perpetuity to fund this particular activity, or you give the police the ability to say, actually, for example, you've been in central London twice already this month. for this third and fourth one that you want, there is now our resources are so thin in the lack of police who need days off, who need rest time, that we can't do this without cutting other areas, and therefore kind of give it a rest for a week. Or you accept that policing protests is effectively going to have a higher priority than other areas of policing, say, like of all of the other ways in, and you're finding other areas to cut that you would not want to do, and that seems to me to be a really difficult situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Kirsty, I can see you need a charger. If you lift that slap up, there's a plug.
Thank you very much.
Jeanette's going to help you. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move over to Assemblymember Desai.
Before we just go, can I just...
Yes, of course. Microphone,
So,
please.
good morning, panel. In terms of asking organizations that organize protests on a very regular basis over a period of time, and asking them to contribute towards their share of the policing costs, I see the logic of what you're saying, but I'm thinking of the practicality. So, I mean, let's look at what's been happening over the last year. The organization that has been calling the marches on a more or less regular basis for the last year has been the President's Solidarity Campaign. Now, take a scenario where the organization...
Who are very heavily funded by trade unions in Britain, it's worth pointing out.
Okay. Leaving that aside, although I think we're talking of the cost of policing this protest, something in the region of £42 million.
Which is a separate question that is probably out with about which...
If the organisation doesn't have the resources and doesn't, feel that it's got a right to protest, and I'm just looking at a scenario where tens of thousands of people just turn up, and the organisation said either we don't have the resources or we are not going to pay because we believe it's a fundamental right to protest. I follow the logic of what you're saying, don't get me wrong, but I'm thinking of the practicality of implementing such a proposal, because laws become discredited when they can't be implemented.
It's a valid point, and it touches on another important issue where we definitely want to avoid a situation of a two-tier system, if I can, where protests that go through official channels are, let me put it this way, that protests which choose not to follow the law in going through official channels and giving the level of notice and just effectively turn up can get away with it. And so another one of the recommendations in my review is to increase the penalties for those who choose to disregard the system and have what are effectively illegal protests. But obviously, when the police on public order grounds, when they see tens of thousands of people turning up, they will often choose to facilitate those protests. And at the moment, I believe the penalties for doing so are disproportionately low. But you are right to probe on, potential difficulties in enabling this a contribution towards payments to going ahead. I would say, look, of the, well, how many are? I think it's 41, forgive me. Of the 41, is one of 41 recommendations. I would not say it is one of the central recommendations of my review. And I do believe that if this forces people to think more seriously about one of my alternative recommendations, which is to allow the police to factor in the cost of resources in making decisions on in what manner repeat protests go ahead. I hope that will have been constructive.
But before you go on, I can see there is different views from... Can we very, very briefly hear both Kirsty and Matt's very quick reviews on that? Only we've got a lot of questions to go through, but I can see you're not quite in agreement, so let's hear your views.
I cannot see how a proposal for protesters to pay is lawful, and and it shows a real misunderstanding of Articles 10 and Articles 11. Article 10.2 means that the right to protest can only be actually restricted in specific circumstances, and payment would not be one of those circumstances. And also it ignores that there's a positive right to protest that the state must facilitate. And so the proposal completely ignores, and I think misunderstands that. It's unlawful. It wouldn't get off the ground, and practically it's completely unworkable and would lead to much discrimination and the sort of issues that have already been raised by the panel.
Okay, thank you. Matt, have you got a...
I think I'm probably more instinctively supportive of what lies behind Lord Walney's proposals, but I agree with Kirsty, completely unworkable. Protester pays, I simply cannot see how that could be made to work. Even if there was a legal framework that supported it, I can't see how it could practically be made to work. Allowing the police to say, effectively, we're a bit busy this month, you know, we can't have this protest, we can't accept it, it's cost us too much this month already. I'm afraid that would enable police to set the bar far too low, and effectively they'd always be able to find an excuse to not to do it. Now, you know, I agree the costs, which of course in the Met and all other police forces, they have the ability to apply for special grants to cover it. But you're right, ultimately the taxpayer is paying from a limited pot and something else suffers as a consequence. That's agreed. But I don't think the way to reset the balance is to use any of those effective banning orders or payment or billing orders that you're recommending. I just can't see how it would work.
Thank you, panel. Very interesting, food for that. We'll go back to you, Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. So moving on, panel, the issue of resources, and if I can start off with you, Matt, and can I also say what you said earlier about the way the Met police's public order sort of protest, I think is very commendable, and the command and control centre in particular, I think is is something I've been there for the last 7 years in the course of visiting Notting Hill Carnival, a most impressive operation. But about resources, so the Commissioner has said that additional funding the Met gets from the government in recognition of the unique challenges of policing London falls short by is around £240 million. Just policing Notting Hill Carnival every year costs the Met something in the region of £11.8 million. And I understand that policing the protests around the Middle East conflict over the last 12 months has cost the Met something in the region of £43 million with 52,000 police officer shifts. So clearly we're talking of considerable sums of money here. Should the government be allocating more money to the Met in light of increased protest activity on top of regular public order demand?
It's a perennial debate held between the Home Office, the Met, and indeed other police forces. If the figure for 43 million is correct for the last 12 months, I'm surprised it's so low. 2 protests back in October and April 20 from Extinction Rebellion, 2 protests cost the Met £37 million. So if it's 43 million for a year, I'm surprised it's not more. Bearing in mind that £37 million, taking Lord Walney's point, is twice the cost of the Violent Crime Task Force. So, these are very significant impacts. Should the Met get more? The Met already gets streams of funding that are not available to other police forces elsewhere in the country. They get a capital city grant, amongst others. The Home Office changed the rules a couple of years ago with special grants. Previously, a special grant could only be given for something that was, if you like, a one-off and somewhat unexpected. So, Champions League final in Cardiff, or I'm trying to think of the Olympics or something. The Home Office changed the rules so that sustained pressure over a extended period also qualified for special grants. So the Met has that as a route to make it. I think the perception outside London is the Met is overfunded, and if you look at per head of police officer per head of population, the Met already gets more than the rest of the country. But I was always sympathetic to the view that the unique demands on the Met actually justified that, if not a bit more on top. And I think particularly for the level of public order, protest and large event policing, that has never been adequately funded by the Home Office in comparison to the demands the Met has.
Kirsty, if I can come to you.
Well, funding is slightly outside my expertise, but I would underline that it's important not to focus on protest itself and the irritations of protest and the unruliness of it, but to look at it in the context that this is the lifeblood of a democracy that we are considering. And so funding to ensure the functioning of a democracy might be one way of considering when you're looking at police resources.
I think there are questions later on about how the demands of policing marches in central London takes the police away from the communities that they're meant to be serving. But there are questions later on. So we can't see protest justly in a very narrow sense and in a very abstract manner. It has implications for other sections of society as well.
Absolutely, which is why I put it in that way, that in terms of the allocation of fundings, it's not something really I can comment on.
Yeah.
Other than when you're looking at funding of facilitating protests and policing protests, then its importance really needs to be heavily underlined. But of course, there is always that removal of forces from people who are dealing on a daily basis with thefts, with shopliftings, with burglaries, and so on. And it is a difficult decision.
And finally, Lord Walney, you already given us your views, but have you got anything else to add to?
I think the only thing I'd add is, and the panellists obviously make it an important point. I think I have a bit of a different perspective on the unworkability of placing a bar that allows the police to have a conversation about resources, because I think I don't think you would necessarily put it so low. And I think you might have had real experience of this. I think police leadership worked exceptionally hard in London and across the country to uphold people's right to protest. And in fact, a lot of the conversations and the controversy has been in people pushing from the outside to say, hang on, why are you allowing this activity? And they will be quite robust in saying, no, there is a right for people to protest. So I think it would be possible and appropriate to set the bar sufficiently high so that you are you are only acting when the level of drain becomes disproportionate.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here. Assemblymember Garbutt wants to pick up on this.
Thank you, and thanks for your contribution so far. And I totally agree with protest being part of our democracy, because I'm very glad we don't have to work at the weekends and that women are able to vote due to protest across our country. And just to say that people are choosing to protest, but because of other routes have failed them. So, for example, when 75% of people were saying that they wanted a ceasefire, and that was a very public opinion, and our government weren't doing that. You know, people choose to protest, but because, when other routes have failed. But my question is related to this discussion about police and police volumes, staffing protests. So organisations like Netpol have said that the police are making the choice here to police the protests at the scale that they're policing them. So I just wondered if the panel would like to discuss, or if you agree that the police could decide to police protests differently, picking up on Kirsty's points earlier about them being quick to enforce, and just wondered if there's a comment about how they maybe could choose to staff them differently. I'll maybe start with Matt and then Kirsty. Thanks.
Like you or other members have said, I never, in all these, and I got involved in this when the Home Office asked me to look at it going back to 2020, because at that stage there was a feeling that the balance wasn't right of competing. Of course, everyone recognised there is a right to protest, but that right is not unfettered. It depends on a balance between the rights of the people who are affected by the protests. It's not just disorder, it is a balance to be struck. And I've sometimes heard the changes to legislation that have been made since, and could debate those for a session all on its own, described as an attempt to introduce a police state and eradicate protest. Nobody I've ever talked to, off the record, on the record, has ever suggested anything other than that. In 2020, the College of Policing was rewriting their guidance to police commanders. And it started by saying, in our country, we treasure the right to protest. And I remember arguing with them and winning the argument that treasure was too unneutral a word. And it created a mindset in which police leaders found it difficult to make that, to get the balance right. It swayed it one side of the pendulum. And what we weren't looking for was the pendulum, and neither was Priti Patel or indeed Suella Braverman, who both asked me to look at this. They weren't seeking to swing the pendulum all the way down. They were seeking to nudge it back into a bit where the public was slightly more comfortable. Because the public perception of what's acceptable and what's not is very different to that perhaps in this room or what you will hear in erudite panels talking about it. Public tolerance for the disruption is very low, repeatedly shown to be low. Doesn't mean the public are right. It just means that the balance needs to be, in my view, needed to be nudged back a little bit towards where the public were. All the decisions that the police are making, I don't think that there has been a fundamental change post-COVID or post the legislation. It has just it's just acted, the legislation has acted as a reminder to people that have to make decisions that the balance that needs to be struck might not always be in the place that the protesters think it is.
So just picking up on a few points there, I think it's a really interesting question on the amount of how policing is carried out. And I've certainly seen changes over the last couple of decades. And if I go back to the May Day riots, it was much more there that there were helicopters overhead, the technology was different, and then the evidence was accumulated by examining the footage. Now, these were riots, criminal damage. Many of those cases would have been outside any protection of Article 10 and Article 11 of freedom of expression. They are pure crimes of violence, including violence against property. Then we're now, fast forward, we're in a world where we have body cam. And that the body cams, therefore, in my view, encourages the evidence collecting talking to the protester, and then that filming of that conversation being relied on. Now, whether that translates into having a greater number of people around a protester in order to get that footage, I don't know. However, it is a point as to whether the number of police are needed on each particular demonstration. And just going back very briefly to the payment suggestion, of course, protesters could say, we don't actually need any policing at all. There's not going to be any disturbance. We're completely peaceful. So we don't want police there, which is another reason why it shouldn't just be assumed that the police are there to stop violence. They should be there as well to facilitate and ensure that the protesters are protected. I've got a very concrete example that I referred to on Lambert Road in the summer of last year, where there was very quick enforcement. And undoubtedly that was triggered by the police having new powers under the Public Order Act 2023. The judgment in that case, the High Court judgment, is one which I'd recommend that the panel reads, because it does go back to the consideration before that legislation came in. Part of that consideration was that the legislation would lead to an increase of prosecution. So it anticipated there would be further expenditure because there would be an increase in arrests when this legislation came through. And so I disagree that arrests are in any way different or down they have clearly been anticipated to increase by the new legislation, and that is what we've seen happening. It's a much lower enforcement bar, and the regulations that came in, which have been declared unlawful, have brought the bar of serious disruption down to more than minor. And that is one thing that this panel really needs to tackle, and it's causing a real problem for the police now, because that judgment is there. It's been there since May, and it's in absolute limbo that we have these regulations, and the police should not be arresting for protests where disruption is more than minor. They should be back to the primary legislation of serious disruption, and that's been causing a problem, and we can see those cases clogging up the courts and taking up time and expense.
I think it's worth, before going into the appropriateness of policing resources at particular events, I think it's just worth a moment on probing your assumption that our democracy doesn't work because our particular views were not followed when they were shown in an opinion poll to be in majority. I mean, you will probably know that public opinion over very complex foreign affairs issues can fluctuate very rapidly, and it would be quite problematic for any government to base its foreign policy on what the public felt about a particular issue on a basis of an opinion poll from week to week. But presumably, if you did follow that line that we should just do what the majority want, then we would be taking a very different attitude to policing protests, because as Matt Parr pointed out, and I've done a significant amount of research and polling for my review, there is very strong intolerance of really any kind of disruptive protest. And yet, as lawmakers, we take a more balanced judgment, which in a representative democracy that isn't done by opinion poll from day to day, I think it's probably appropriate that we do.
Just to clarify, it was more the sense of people feeling like they've used all the traditional methods to influence decision makers and still continuing not to be heard. Example of like the Colston statue being pulled into the river in Bristol. They'd done petitions. It was more to do with using traditional methods to influence. Yeah. So maybe my example wasn't the best.
Understood. And it is important. And this is difficult because we live in a complex world, and there are we have millions of people with different views, and it is not always easy for people to get what they want and one of the main conclusions from my review is that we have to be much clearer. We ought to be much clearer that actually keeping protest and objection and stating your point of view within legal parameters is really important, because there is no other way, in my view, that you can avoid ending up justifying levels of extremism, because every person who takes extreme action thinks that they are have an obligation to do so, and that the normal methods of being able to change people's minds have been exhausted, and we only really have a legal framework which ought to be robust, which we should continue to debate and scrutinise. But once we justify stepping outside of that, I think we are in very dangerous territory.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, can I just add, we're talking about peaceful
Can I ask
protest.
that this is very quick, because we are really very, very over time now.
I just want to 2 seconds. We're talking about peaceful protest, not extremism, and that's the discussion. Extremism, violence, criminal damage is likely to fall outside any protection of Article 10, Article 11. It's important that distinction's made.
Okay, thank you. Right, colleagues, we must be more succinct, and panel as well, please. Lord Bailey.
I'm going to start with Matt Parr and good morning, panel. Is the Met making appropriate use of Section 12 and Section 14 orders under the Public Order Act 1986 to manage the protests we've seen, it's mainly in October, around those ways?
Remind me what those provisions cover, or maybe Kirsty.
Do you want to start, Kirsty? But it's basically the provision to say things about the route where people will stop, making exclusion zones, etc., etc.
Yeah, the Met has a sort of basic policy, which is the more, although it's inconvenient for the centre of London, the more protest that happens in the centre of London at the weekend is easier for them to control. If you look at, I remember sort of talking to a public order commander and saying, this is all going very well, and her response to me was, yeah, but crikey, if this was happening in Bromley, it'd be out of control by now. And that's partly because the level of experience in running protests in that central area, and frankly, the level of CCTV access and no comms blind spots. So, and huge CCTV access. So their spatial awareness of something going on in central London at a weekend at a time, controlled by them, is not only it's usually what the protesters want, but it works hugely in the Met's favour because it allows them to control from a public order and public safety point of view the protest in a way that they would find much more difficult had they not put certain strictures on it. So it's not just a question of making life difficult for people that want to run protests. It's also the foundations of those decisions are very usually public order and public safety rather than any attempt to inhibit protest.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you, Kirsty, with a slight, because you'll have a different perspective because you're representing people who want to protest. Do they feel that the Met is heavy-handed in its or light touch in its use of those powers to suggest route to section of certain physical places and etc.? How do they feel about that?
I'm not sure I can give an opinion on how absolutely everybody feels.
Of course.
I could say about Section 12 that it's not working. And the reason for that is because the restriction can be imposed if there may be serious public disorder. And we now have in limbo what serious public disorder means because the regulations define serious public disorder as meaning more than minor. They came in after the Public Order Act. In fact, I think they came in before, but that's the definition. And those regulations have now been held to be unlawful by the High Court. So we're in limbo on that. The Lambeth Bridge case, which I'm just looking back at it, was on the 17th of July 2023. And there's a number of defendants still going through the court. They experienced an officer saying to them, a Section 12 condition is now applying. And there was no detail as to it. And within 15 minutes, they are arrested and they are now being prosecuted in the magistrates' courts. Many have been acquitted because they should not have been arrested in the first place. And so it's not working well. And it's given more powers to the police, which the police were not seeking in the first place. And unfortunately, when there are more powers, then inevitably they start to be used and perhaps not used appropriately. So we're seeing a lot of resources going on these cases where, in fact, prior to the Public Order Act, these types of protests would have continued without any issue at all.
But could someone suggest that there are more powers because the police need more powers, and those the uptick of arrests is what people wanted to result from those extra powers, because we've seen lots of disruption in London. I come from a community where our children are murdered regularly. I would prefer the police were locally investigating that, not at protests that have been going on week in, week out. So the public, many people from my community, are rightly asking for the situation to be changed to draw those police elsewhere. They would feel differently to the application of these more powers. So with a different perspective, is this overuse, or is this the direction that the public are trying to tug back in?
So in relation to public opinion, consultations before these particular restrictions were brought in, certainly the police didn't ask for them, and I'm not aware of the public specifically asking for a lowering of serious disorder. The cases that you're talking about, certainly the more serious cases arising out of protests are the ones where the police had sufficient power in any event to arrest. The House of Lords, in fact, rejected the primary legislation on this, that this additional, so Parliament together rejected this lower definition of serious disruption. And that's why the regulations that have come in are said to be unlawful. I'm headlining it, but that's where we are, that Parliament itself take into account representations from constituents, rejected lowering the standard for serious disruption. But of course, your point is always a significant one, and one that, of course, has to be balanced in terms of it. But protest is irritating. It's annoying, and that is actually part of it. So that also has to be worked into feedback that constituents will undoubtedly be saying to the MPs and their reaction to protest.
I'm going to move on and come to Law Walney. Protest isn't irritating. Protest can be, and for many communities, is downright dangerous. Irritating would suggest it's minor. I made the point about my community and our very high murder rate. For us, it's lethal, so I wouldn't use the word irritating. The Met, Lord Walney, have been accused many times of two-tier policing following violent disorder in late July and early August. Are these accusations fair? What is the impact of these claims on individual officers on the ground?
I don't think they're fair in the way that they are being made, and there was a strong and an appropriate response from the Met and forces across the country to the very serious violence that occurred in the August riots. That was right, and I think I understand the frustration of people who have looked, for example, at the weekly marches on Gaza and seen the levels of criminality around the edges of those marches and thought that not sufficient was done on that. But there was a difference in the level of threat, in that there was a clear risk and indeed an occurrence of serious public disorder, effectively a riot that was happening in communities which saw that stronger response. Where I think I hope lawmakers will focus on is in a gap in the Public Order Act, and it's actually in section 13, not 12 or 14 of the Public Order Act, which is the section which allows the police to recommend to the Home Secretary that a march does not go ahead at a particular date and a particular time, because you will all be aware that many members of Jewish communities in London have been deeply troubled by the marches, have seen the explosion in anti-Semitism that has occurred around them, have felt uncomfortable or unsafe going into central London every week. And I've asked why the police can't give them a break and send the march, either say, no, not this week, have it every other Saturday, or go somewhere else other than central London, give central London a break. Now, the police are clear, and I think they are right in their interpretation of the law, that they are not allowed to do that at the moment, because the strengthening of the Public Order Act, which has happened in recent years, which has applied a test of cumulative disruption to conditions being placed on a march. So effectively, although the march might not reach the level of a riot, having marches week after week and the anti-Semitism is cumulative negative harm should be mitigated. Now, that can be mitigated by placing conditions on the march through sections 12 and 14, but there is no power to say, actually, don't have the march in London this week or vary the date. The police do not have that authority, and they should have the ability to take into account cumulative disruption in making those recommendations to the Home Secretary. It's recommendation 14 of my review.
I just want to return to this idea of two-tier policing. Even in our own notes, it talked about the spreading of disinformation, and it used the word right-wing. It makes no inference to the fact that other people, left-wing, for want of a better term, spread disinformation. And is this cultural way of discussing this, misinformation, two-tier policing, however you want to name it, is it focused on one particular set of people, so therefore has some truth to it? I'll ask Matt and then I'll come back to you. Sure.
I'm with Lord Walney. I don't think it's a fair criticism. I was asked recently to sort of compare the way that the Southport disturbances were dealt with in comparison to what happened in Leeds, Hare Hills, a couple of days before, a week or so before. They're just from a policing point of view, they weren't comparable. Okay. And so to expect the same response week in, week out to different situations is very naive. However, I understand why people make the accusation. You can see how people have joined the dots and concluded that there is two-tier policing. And I go back to the first comment I made, which is that if there's something that the Met haven't done well, I don't think they've explained their actions to the public as clearly and as proactively as they could do to explain why they're doing things that might look to some people to be unbalanced with how they've treated another incident. I just want to correct where I've got my red light on. Kirsty said that the police didn't ask for a lowering of the bar on serious disturbance. They did. This is where the changes in law were kicked off. What they didn't ask for, and what I didn't recommend in my reports, was that bar went down quite as far as it has. My preference was serious should be replaced by significant. The Home Office ended up defining serious as anything more than minor, and that, frankly, is where the trouble started. But the police were quite keen for clarity and some guidance on what serious was. What they didn't want, what they didn't expect was what they got.
Kirsty, just before you answer, I want to come to you. Somebody wrote to me and made a complaint that people who had spread disinformation who were perceived of right-wing were prosecuted and ended up in jail and had community service, all the rest of that. But certain leaders of certain left-wing groups who admitted publicly that they'd spread disinformation didn't receive any police intervention at all. Is this something that you've heard, seen? Is it just hearsay? Is there any evidence that certain political views are pursued more doggedly by the law?
I think firstly on what disinformation, what crime it is that's being alleged. I'm not sure on that what the actual crime would be. Unfortunately, the social media world is full of disinformation, and undoubtedly there's huge amounts of disinformation from whatever political stripes or non-political stripes. As to the protests that I've been involved in as a barrister, they've ranged from those relating to Black Lives Matter, to those relating to Plain Stupid, to Extinction Rebellion, to people who were anti-fracking in both civil and criminal courts of appeals. So there's obviously May Day riots, which was anti-capitalism, I think, back in the day. I haven't seen evidence of particular prejudice in terms of which views are facilitated and which views aren't. And I think in that respect, generally, with lots of push and pull with the Metropolitan Police, I would say generally the police are doing a good job. And I perhaps end where I started, that it seemed much clearer pre-COVID to the police as to that point leading up to enforcement. Now there's lots of confusion. I didn't mean to say that the police had not asked for clarification of serious disorder. They asked for clarification and said it would be useful. What I said was they did not ask for additional powers policing protest, in that they said, certainly the initial consultation, that they had sufficient powers, and that was before both acts then went through.
Just briefly, Lord Bailey, I would not describe this as an issue of prejudice, but I think one of the conclusions of my review, which was to look unusually across the domestic situation, looking at the far right, but also the far left in the UK. And one of the conclusions of my review was that there is a gap in knowledge and understanding of extreme left-wing and anarchist movement, and that should be addressed within security and intelligence infrastructure because of the latent damage that it can do, that those movements can do, sometimes aided by foreign states, to our democratic systems. And I hope that's recommendation 5 of the review. I hope that they take it up. And briefly on, just further on two-tier policing, where I think there is an issue, and this is difficult for any police force to be able to overcome, but I think there can be latently a greater risk of where protesters are overwhelmingly and obviously peaceful and not in danger of spilling over into violence and public order offences, I think inevitably they can sometimes end up being treated more harshly because police officers have looked at situations in the recent past and thought, are we going to go in heavy here? And thought, well, look, if we do that, there is an aggravated risk of there is a risk of aggregating the situation and causing further disturbance and the situation running out of control. So that basically, if you look like you're threatening to kick off, then you may end up getting away with more than if you are obviously not going to cause the police trouble, and that is a real issue.
Okay, Chair, Eileen.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the issue of the two-tier policing. And Matt, you said people join the dots. And I hope you weren't thinking that they joined the dots and came to the conclusion that there was two-tier policing. Because, looking at the riots, I'm going to call them riots, that occurred after the Southport killings, we have an explanation from the Met commander, because obviously the Met were criticised for the supposed heavy-handedness with how they dealt with the Downing Street protests. But the Met Commissioner has told us that that a proactive approach to policing that violence led to 52 people being charged, with more to follow. The people involved in this are habitually violent. 2/3 of those who committed offences had a previous arrest for violence. 4 in 10 had a history of violence against women and girls. And 4 of them are known to police for child sexual abuse and exploitation. This put paid to the idea that these were decent British citizens protesting. Taking those violent people off the streets is just one aspect of the hard work officers and staff had to do over the summer. And we do know, do we not, that social media played a part in this? And I accept that many law-abiding people were caught up in these riots, but a lot of the fomenting had a background of hate, for example, EDL, and so forth. And you can, I think, just look at some of that hate in some of these riots by the fact that they targeted the most vulnerable people in asylum house hostels, attempted, for example, to set fire to a hostel, with the Downing Street protest, they were throwing beer cans and bottles. So very different, I would say, backgrounds to the to the arrangement and the organisation of these protests.
Yes, I agree. And of course, I don't think there is intentional two-tier policing. There isn't kind of, well, we don't like those, so we're going to police the heck out of them. But these people are kind of we approve of, so we'll give them an easy ride. There is no question of that. That doesn't happen. But people could, when I said join the dots, people could look at what happened at Hare Hills, widespread damage, police vehicles torched, etc., and then say, and where were the police? They just weren't there.
Yeah.
Now, the reason they weren't there is because that happened in, I think, West Yorkshire Police, almost without notice. And I think it would have been an enormous challenge for West Yorkshire Police, which is not, it's a big force in national terms, but it's nothing like the size of the Met. To produce the resources at no notice that they needed to police that and command it would have been a huge challenge for them. So they chose to police it in a different way, to stand back, frankly. There's no way the police could have stood back for e.g. the Southport riots, because as you quite rightly point out, there was widespread criminality and a real threat to public order and individual safety. So it is inevitable that the police dealt with it in that way. So I agree with what you said about the kind of, if you threaten that you might cause a lot of trouble, you might get people standing back. And the classic example of that is probably the Colson statue incident, where the police decided to stand back and watch it, which created some outrage, understandably. So you can see why people form the view. They form it because they don't understand the operational challenges that forces have to face. And my argument is that that's an inevitable challenge. The police should do as much as they can to explain why they're doing things differently.
And another thing, if I can just very briefly.
Can we be very, very quick, because we're stopping in 20 minutes, Assembly Member, whether the questions are finished or not.
Yeah, it was just very briefly. The Met Commissioner's also said that one of his prime concerns is about the serious voices who echo the accusations of two-tier policing because they legitimise that idea. And I think in that respect he's talking perhaps for a certain MP or Elon Musk on Twitter. I'm just wondering how difficult that is and if there's anything that can be done about that.
It wouldn't be the first time politicians that didn't really understand what they were talking about with policing expressed an opinion.
Yeah.
Ouch. Can I say that is an important issue. I think there is also a wider issue for all of us privileged to be in positions of leadership in being conscious of what we instinctively understand and judge in a particular way and what we don't. And by that I mean that sometimes, and I don't think this is an accusation that's levelled at the Met, but actually it can across the political spectrum, often we understand right-wing extremism largely. We know what it looks like. We are clear we don't like it. And so we are much more comfortable, rightly, in pushing back against it. And I think there is sometimes a fear and a lack of understanding within other cultures that can mean we can end up making mistakes that we have to really guard against. I think there have been issues in recent years. For me, the question of whether the statement from the river to the sea should be illegal is difficult. I think it's certainly an extreme statement. It is deeply offensive to, I would say, the large majority of Jewish people in this country. It is really surprising that you would have someone who makes those kind of statements or chants advising a police force. And I think that decision would be much obvious and clear-cut if it were placed in a different context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just very briefly.
Please, because we're really running over.
Madam Chair, yes, I understand that. 2 points. What you're looking at with incendiary messaging on social media is you're looking at, can there be any enforcement against those platform providers. It's very difficult and it's also very important, so that should continue to be looked at. Secondly, in terms of actions of setting fire, the violence, the terrible violence that we saw in those riots, they would be outside any peaceful protest protection. So you're simply looking at criminality there, and there's no issues around enforcement there with that criminality. Operationally, of course, it's up to the police at what point they make the enforcement.
Okay, thank you. I will repeat, we've got less than 15 minutes. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Notting Hill Carnival. So, following the tragic deaths of 2 people at this year's carnival, what can the Mayor and the Met do to avoid such a tragic situation at future events, indeed violence of any type whatsoever? If I can start off with you, Matt, again.
I was hoping we were going to run out of time before we got to me, actually, on this subject. I find this really difficult to talk about. I think I've seen the carnival 3 or 4 times through my time as an HMI, close up. It's an enormous policing challenge. And whereas it is a sort of badge of honour for police officers in public order to command a successful Notting Hill Carnival, I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of Met Police opinion would be that it didn't happen. That's clearly, in social cohesion terms, a really difficult question. And my conclusion is that we're probably, I won't say stuck with it, that's the wrong thing, because there's many good things about it, but from a criminality and public order thing, it's one of those things that if it hadn't been invented, if it hadn't been invented, it wouldn't be allowed, because of not so much a sort of, there's nothing cultural, even criminality in this. From a public safety point of view, it's probably the biggest headache the Met face on a regular basis, and the fact that there hasn't been some sort of mass casualty event year after year is probably only thanks to the expertise that the Met have, and frankly a bit of luck.
I'll come back to that point. That's my second question. Lord Walney, anything to add? No. Okay, so my second question, thank you, was actually about improving crowd safety, and in particular crushing. I'll just make 2 points here. Firstly, I think we are handicapped, Chair, by the absence of anyone from the Notting Hill Carnival Limited who were invited, but they don't even respond, because there's 2 parts to this equation: the police, but the organisers. And having been there for the last 7 years with the police to observe the policing, the lack of proper stewarding is a major factor. And in 2016, the Assembly did do a report on making Notting Hill Carnival safer and better, where we drew attention to the dangers of possible serious injuries and possibly fatalities as a result of mass crushing. Commander Musker was here about 4 years ago, and he made the point that particularly, or the year before, they had come within a whisker of having casualties and possibly fatalities as a result of crushing. And that's what the police said to us at the last police and crime committee in the form of Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist. Is there anything particular you think that the Met could do to improve crowd safety, and particularly the issue of crushing at Carnival?
I don't know in detail. I mean, I think I've heard people suggest it should be moved outside. I think that would be politically an incredibly challenging argument to make. I think there is an argument made that the amount of criminality at the Notting Hill Carnival, even this year, with fatalities, is actually not that bad compared to the general level of criminality in London, or indeed other very significant events. Not sure I buy that, but I think I've always viewed it as Matt Twist has said, the biggest worry about it is a mass casualty event caused by loss of control of enormous crowds in a very confined space. So I just think it's a headache that the Met's probably going to have to continue to live with and learn everything they can from reports like the one that you hold.
Look, I think that's right, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to add.
That's why it's a shame the organisers aren't here. But
I'm not sure I can comment on the policing of Notting Hill Carnival.
Thank you. Chair,
Okay, thank you.
I'll just say what we said in the report. The status quo is not an option. That position still
you
remains
and
the
I
same.
agree with each other completely about
you.
that. And if I could just
I wanted
say...
to just flag our report. MOPED
definitely.
has not yet responded to our recommendation 7 years on.
No, they should respond to that. And if I could just say that Mark Rowley actually last month said that there was a possibility of a mass fatality event. This is how serious it is. I wish we had more time because I feel very strongly about this, as many will know. Now, in the meantime, everybody, we would like to say hello to the Pupil Parliament from Aldborough Primary School in Redbridge.
Hello.
You're very, very welcome. Okay, so now there's a question to Matt Parr from Assemblymember Garbett.
Thank you. Just to touch on the new legislation, I wondered, Matt, if you could speak to your views on the use of the conspiring to disrupt national infrastructure and how we've seen that used to arrest people who are participating in workshops or planning sessions, and just particularly around environmental protest, and wondered your views on how that balances with people's right to protest.
Sorry. Yeah, this was one of the things that the Home Office discussed with us and asked us to look at. We were extremely lukewarm about specifically whether new legislation was needed covering key national infrastructure or construction. Our view was that the existing legislation allowed the police the powers, and that's where I agree with Kirsty, is that the police's view on that was they already had sufficient powers to deal with those cases. So making critical national infrastructure or building projects a sort of special case requiring special legislation was not something that I recommended back in 2022.
Thank you. And just, I know we're short on time, but Kirsty, just to speak to the conditions around, so to quote Michael Frost from the US Special Rapporteur of Environmental Defenders has expressed concerns about the overuse of bail conditions on protesters, and I just wondered if you could speak to the cost of the way some of this legislation has been used.
Yes, I remember when protesters used to be dealt with in a way where the bail would be limited. They would often be dealt with by given a bind over, which is stay out of trouble, don't reoffend in the next 12 months, and you won't have a criminal record. And then there's some protection there. And I would like to see, in terms of sentencing and enforcement, a slightly more creative approach and a return back to the way that protesters used to be dealt with. And that obviously excludes, and I really do emphasise this, that excludes those people who are not peacefully protesting. And the riots that we saw in the summer, they are not part of peaceful protest. They're outside that. We have all the powers we need for criminality, and those where there is criminality, those cases tend to be prosecuted and go through the courts. But there are many in between. People who feel very strongly about causes who are caught up and they find their lives put on hold for years now because of the backlogs in the cases. And that is destructive not only for their lives, but in fact it doesn't actually add an extra layer of protection to the public. And ultimately those types of cases tend to be found to be disproportionate interference, and ultimately there's no further action taken. So I would like to see less protesters on bail, and perhaps that goes back to, as well, less enforcement to start off with, and a return to pre-COVID policing.
Okay, Lord Bailey, very briefly, please.
This is specifically for Matt. In your 2020... Excuse me. In your 2021 HMICFRS, you really need a snappier name for that thing, review, you wrote that the police do not strike the right balance between protecting the public and the right to protest on every occasion, and that this balance may too readily tip in favour of the protesters rather than the public. In your view, how far has the Met gone towards redressing this balance, particularly in terms of the demonstrations we have seen since the attacks in the Middle East on October 2023?
I know you're short for time. A bit. Some. And whether they've gone far enough, whether that, as I described it earlier, that pendulum has swung back too far, is really a matter of taste and opinion. But they have definitely swung a little bit I think the other panel members will offer you views every bit as valid as mine about whether it's now in the right place or not.
Okay, I'm just going to come to you because it's directly about what you written in your report. So you think they've come back a little bit in the.
Yes, I do, and I think that probably whereas there are clear problems with the legislation, otherwise the High Court wouldn't have intervened. There was a realisation and a recognition at the time that the legislation would, however it was enacted and interpreted, it would act as a message from the government to the police that the public and the government didn't feel the balance was in the right place. So part of it was signalling to have an influence on decision-makers' mindsets, as well as being specific laws. And I also mentioned that kind of "we treasure" protest. Well, that was changed to "we acknowledge" or "we recognise" or something like that. So there was an attempt at the same time to change the mindset of police officers, because they simply didn't recognise that those protest rights had to be balanced with the rights of those who were affected by the protest but may have no interest in it.
Okay, thank you. Chair?
Thank you. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. Just wanted to bring up the 23-24 Football League season, where the Met only managed to recover about 10% of the costs of those events. What more could be done to recoup that money, and what impact would recouping that money have?
No, I'm not sure this is my bailiwick as advisor on political violence.
I mean, if the Met wanted to play hardball, they could refuse the events to take place unless people coughed up a larger amount of money. Don't forget, the vast majority of security at football matches is not done by police officers, it's done by employed stewards. So the bill for football matches has actually gone down. If you look at sort of historical levels, they cost the Met much less, and they've, as I say, transferred. But trying to get the football clubs to pay more, again, I'm not an expert in that.
And Matt, you talked there about the Met saying we won't police the event, basically. Would it ever be appropriate for the Mayor to intervene on that operation level? Matt?
Yeah, it could be. I don't see any reason why it's not. Of course, unlike the right to protest, there are no enshrined laws about the entitlement to go to a football match. So it seems to me that if they wish to ban it because football clubs were reneging on an agreement, he would have that authority, I would have thought.
Does an issue arise, though, with a political involvement of the Mayor of London in things like policing of football matches or perhaps concerts, when the Mayor of London's taking freebies to go to those events?
The Mayor of London is responsible as the Police and Crime Commissioner for London for oversight of the Met, and anything he wishes to discuss with the Met like that seems to me to be a perfectly valid conversation to have.
Thanks. His favourite line to us is, "I have no oversight of operational matters and I wouldn't get involved." That's his favourite line, but I will put to him your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, the last question, and if we can have very brief answers, Assemblymember Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is on abstractions, because actually in the community where I represent in Brenton Harrow, it is having a major impact when people are telling me that they've called the police on a weekend and witnessing a drug deal on their street, and no one seems to be coming out to respond to it. It's having a real-life impact on communities on the ground. Because you referred to it in some of your answers and remarks in the beginning, Lord Walney, about the balances and the different choices that have to be made, and you've obviously alluded to in your report as well. How can the Met reduce its reliance on abstraction and aid, and how can it lessen the impact that abstraction has on neighbourhood teams in particular?
I'm not an expert on the detail of this, but obviously the point of the pull between having to do large scale regular policing of large scale protests compared to these bread and butter issues for communities is an important factor in this, and I think there is a danger as lawmakers if we fail to understand and acknowledge just the depth of frustration that the public have with the ways in which our police force is being stretched. There are a number of causes for that, but this is one of them, and I believe it's one in which could be addressed.
Thank you. Matt?
I completely agree. It's a perennial difficult question. I don't think there's anything they can do in the short term. They can't magic up more trained officers in either public order or community work. So we're just going to have to live with it. I think that Lord Walney's point about the debate about at what point does this become excessive and have a disproportionate impact on all the other things a police force should do is absolutely valid. And whereas we might not agree about the way to solve it, it's an absolute debate that ought to be happening. And it doesn't, because the voices that are impacted by the sort of problems you've described are not as loud or as forceful as the people that are impacted by protest.
Thank you. Kirsty, you want to come in?
This has been a problem with the criminal justice system as a whole that I've seen collapsing over many years, and it's a wide problem. It needs urgent resources into the whole system, because even if you have some enforcement with the person who's witnessed a drug deal, or their bike has been stolen, or there's been shoplifting, even if something then happens, the chances of that case actually being heard in court in the near future is very low. And if it's serious, there's about 70,000 backlog of cases in the Crown Court. So the system itself is not functioning. There needs to be a movement so that communities are policed and protected. And there needs to be, in terms of enforcement, we are seeing far too many cases going through the courts prosecuting protesters, which years ago would not have been prosecuted. And so I'd like some review of that and some rebalancing on do police resources really need to go into prosecuting this person, whatever the other pressures around, or is this a case where, in fact, a few words of warning can be given to that protester or those protesters and resources deployed elsewhere?
Can I just quickly add to that? I agree with a significant amount of what Kirsty has said in terms of the problems that the bunging up and of the criminal justice system is causing across the piece. But where I have a different perspective is that actually the length of time that it's come to take things to prosecution for serious protest-related offences has in the recent past meant that there has not been sufficient deterrent effect. And I think that if you, I presume, I mean, I guess this is not what Kirsty means, but I think if you are basically ram raiding into a factory and taking a sledgehammer to the roof and terrorising the people in there, that is a serious crime. And actually, there has been a problem in recent about the length of time which it is taken to get people convicted of those kind of crimes, which allows the organisers to effectively say to people who are on the edge of this kind of criminal activism, hey, you know, it'll be okay, you'll never get caught. Look, these people are still walking free and they did this, you know, three years ago. And so effective deterrent sentencing, I think, is really important on protest, but also the wider question of reversing the hollowing out of the criminal justice system, which has happened for many years, is hugely important for us as a country.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm really sorry there are questions left. May we write to you with some of the questions that we haven't had time to put to you? Can I really thank you? It's wonderful to get diverse views because we can all learn from a different point of view. So I really want to say thank you very much to our first panel of guests for attending this morning, and thank you for your answers to our questions. So we're now going to take a short break while we change our panels. Thank you so much.